Now that we've completed our review of the brain, we're going to take a look at how the brain connects to the periphery, and it's going to do that through the spinal cord. So we're going to take a look at some of the spinal tracts of neurons going through that cord. We're going to look at a couple of sensory and just a couple of motor ones. So if this is your spinal cord here, and you imagine this is the anterior part and this is the posterior part, we can divide this cord up into a bunch of neighborhoods that we're going to call funiculi. And funiculi are going to be these groupings in which we're going to have different tracks of neurons going up through them. They're all going to have separate little functions to them, either relaying certain types of sensory information or sending down other types of motor information. These funiculi, like I said, can be divided into tracks, and on this picture here, I've got the spinal cord cut in half, and on the right side it's showing the sensory tracks, and on the left side it's showing some of the motor tracks. And just be aware that they're on both sides of the cord, but this is just so that you can see it more easily and get a good idea of it. We've got these ascending tracts. So the ascending tracts are the sensory neurons, so they're coming from outside of the spinal cord and they're coming up in, and they're going to go up to the brain and get that sensory information to the brain. Most all of these tracks are going to begin with the prefix spinal or spino because it's starting from the spinal cord. And then the suffix is going to be where it ends up at. So for example, we have the spinothalamic tract, and there's actually a lateral one and a ventral one. And these are two that we're going to look at. So they're going from the spine and heading up towards the thalamus. The others, the dorsal columns, have a special name for them, and I'll tell you why when we get to those. The descending tracts are coming down from the brain. They can be coming from the cortex or from any of the nuclei that we talked about before, and they're going to be sending motor impulses to go out to muscles and glands. They're going to end with the suffix spinal, so we may have cerebrospinal or corticospinal. So we're going to have an anterior and a ventral corticospinal tract because they're coming from the cerebral cortex, and that's where that comes from. So let's start with looking at some sensory tracts. We're going to start with what's called the dorsal column medial lemniscus tract. A lot of times you'll just hear us call them the dorsal column tracts. These are bringing information from your periphery. So this is a picture of someone's finger and someone's foot down here. It's bringing information, the somatosensory information, from your skin, muscles, joints, and organs. So we're talking about things like proprioception, the ability to know where your body is located in space without having to see it, or light, touch, and pressure. Those types of senses are going to be coming in through this dorsal column. And what you're going to see is they're going to come into the column. You can see their little cell body is sitting outside of the spinal cord itself, right there. And they're going to come in and they're going to go straight into the column, and they're going to go up before they synapse on any nerve. They're going to come all the way up to the medulla oblongata. And there they're going to cross over and then go up to the thalamus and then synapse there and go to the cortex. So let's just take a look at that. We give these neurons special names. The ones that are coming in are called first order neurons. They are going to be these sensory unipolar cells. This one should have a little unipolar cell body on it too, right out here. And they're going to come in through that dorsal horn and then go right up to that medulla oblongata. And they're going to be traveling in these little tracks here called fasciculi. And one for the lower extremity is called the fasciculus gracilis, because gracile, you can think of like the gracilis muscles in your leg. So that's one way to think of it there. And then as you keep coming up the cord, you're going to have proprioception, touch coming in, and they're just going to keep piling on each other, going out a little bit laterally. So by the time you get up to this, your upper extremity, they're going to have a kind of a little section off here, and this is called the fasciculus cuneatus. And that's going to have information from your upper extremity and the upper part of your trunk. They're each going to go to two different nuclei in the brainstem, and that's why we separate those out here. So these are first order, coming all the way. So it's a nerve that's stretching from your big toe, and it's going to go all the way up to your brainstem. That's one neuron. When it synapses, it's going to synapse onto what we call a second order neuron. So it's just the second neuron in a row here, and it's going to synapse in these nuclei called the gracile nuclei and cuneate nuclei for the tracts that they're traveling in. And they're going to cross at that level of the spinal cord, at the level of the medulla oblongata, and head up to the thalamus. So now it's on the opposite side, so the left thalamus is controlling sensation or receiving sensation from the right side of the body. And actually, this would be showing the left side of the body because in this diagram, here's anterior and this is posterior. So this would be the left side of that person's body. Once it synapses in the thalamus, it's just going to make a straight run to the cortex. So this is a third order because it's the third neuron in a row, and it's going to be sending its neuron to that cerebral cortex. If this is sensory, this would be going to the primary somatosensory cortex or the post-central gyrus. They're both the same thing. And this is where we get our homunculus from, that map of all the sensory information, starting with your foot here in the medial inferior part, and traveling up to your knee and your hip and thigh, and then you have a big space over here for your hand and then your face. So that's what we're seeing in this motor homunculus. That's the dorsal column medial lemniscus tract because it's starting in the dorsal columns, and once it crosses over here, this is called the medial lemniscus. That's the second part of that tract. So we got dorsal column, medial lemniscus, and on the way out. And again, that's proprioception, light touch, and pressure. The other sensory tract I want you to know is called the anterior or anterolateral spinal thalamic tract. So this one's a little bit different. If we've got sensation from the hand and the foot again, you'll notice what these guys are going to do is they're going to come in and they're going to synapse right away in that dorsal horn. And when they synapse, that second order neuron is going to cross right away through this gray commissure here, and then it's going to travel up in this little tract that's kind of anterolateral in the spinal cord, and it's going to go up to the thalamus and then synapse and go out to the cortex. So functionally, we're going to kind of see the same thing. We're going to have this first order neuron coming in, but it's going to synapse right away. And then that second order neuron is going to decussate, so it's going to cross over at the same level of spinal cord, come up in this anterolateral spinal thalamic tract up to the thalamus on the opposite side, so that'd be the contralateral thalamus. It's going to synapse there just like before, and then go to that third order neuron, going all the way up to the cortex. So this will be pain and temperature, going to that same homunculus here. So those are our sensory tracts. We've got plenty of other sensory tracts, which I'm not worried about you knowing. These are the two that we just talked about that you should know. The others, you can kind of figure out where they are, what they're going to. We have a posterior spinocerebellar and an anterior spinocerebellar. I won't make you identify those on the map, but you should be able to recognize they're going from your spine up to your cerebellum. So your cerebellum is going to be doing things that are dealing with motor program, coordinating movements. So they're going to be refining a lot of your motor programs going to your muscles. So that's what they're going to be for. Now we're going to turn to the motor tracts. And the motor tracts are descending, coming from the cortex on down. We also call them pyramidal tracts because they're going through the pyramids of the medulla oblongata. The pyramids are the most medial, sitting right in here, and the olives are just a little bit lateral to that. So the formal name that we're going to use is the corticospinal tract because they're going from the cortex to the spine. And if you look at this, you will see that we'll have basically two sets of nerves here going out to the final muscles as opposed to the sensory system where we were seeing three. So from the cortex down to the spine, we're going to see what's called an upper motor neuron. That's the first of the three, and then the one that leaves the spinal cord is called the lower motor neuron. So we start up here in the cortex in that primary somatomotor area, or the precentral gyrus, and we're going to come down through what's called the internal capsule. That internal capsule is this white area that's right between, it kind of goes right through this basal ganglia. So remember the caudate of the basal ganglia, and we have the rest of it, the putamen, the globus pallidum over here. So it's going right between those two, so that really we can get information from that and give feedback to both the thalamus and the primary motor cortex up here. So it's in a prime place to do that. It's going to continue on down till it hits the medulla oblongata. Now, in the medulla oblongata, about 90% of the fibers are going to decussate. So they're going to go to this lateral side of the opposite side over here, and that's going to become the lateral corticospinal tract. This lateral corticospinal tract is going to be basically going out to your extremities towards your hands and your feet. So the right side of the brain is going to be controlling the left side of the body again. The 10% of the fibers that don't cross in the medulla oblongata are going to stay anterior here. So we're going to call that the anterior corticospinal tract. And they're going to come down, and this picture is showing it like it keeps on going, but it's going to eventually synapse on a lower motor neuron as well. When it does that, it can do one of two things. It can either synapse, I'll just draw a little one right here coming out, and that will synapse onto a lower motor neuron that's going to come out of the system, or it can actually decussate over and synapse on a motor neuron going to the other side. Now, what's different about these guys is that they're not going to be going to the extremities so much. They're going more to your core, so your trunk. They're your stabilization muscles, as opposed to the lateral corticospinal tract, which is going out to your appendages, your arms and your legs. So that's the difference between the anterior corticospinal tract and the lateral corticospinal tracts. And again, they're going to skeletal muscle, so this is your voluntary control. So we can take a look at this chart, and this chart is putting together a bunch of different descending motor tracts. We've just talked about these first two, those coming from the cerebral cortex. And again, they're called cortico, for coming from the cortex, corticospinal tracts, because that's where they live. And they're both pyramidal, so they're going through the pyramids in the medulla oblongata. I don't want you to worry about this. The anterior corticospinal tract, it says it's uncrossed, and I've seen many sources where they're both crossed and uncrossed, so it goes both ways there. The rest of these tracts, we're going to really keep it simple. They're coming from the brainstem in the nuclei. So they're just named for where they come from, and we can kind of look at some of these really quickly. Rubro means red, so that's going to come from the red nucleus. That red nucleus is in your midbrain. Tecto, we think of the tectum, so you have that superior and inferior colliculus. Well, in this case, it's referring to the superior colliculus because that goes to your eye muscles, so it's going to be responsible for eye reflexes. Vestibulo is coming from your vestibular nuclei, and those are going to have to do with balance. And so these are all coming from different parts of that brain stem. Reticulospinal coming from the reticular formation of the medulla and the pons. All of these are extrapyramidal because they are traveling outside of the pyramids of the pons. Remember, the pyramids are more medial, then we've got olives lateral to that. So they're not traveling as part of those pyramids. So this last slide here kind of puts everything all together. We've got our cerebral cortex. And we know from the last slides that we were doing, we've got these pyramidal tracts that they're going straight on down to our spinal cord, and they're going to synapse on the lower motor neurons. Then we've got our basal nuclei. And remember, those basal nuclei are getting information from the cerebral cortex, and they're going to send information to the thalamus to modify that program and send it back out to the cortex so it comes down to the lower motor centers. The basal nuclei also coordinate with the red nucleus in the midbrain and that brainstem reticular formation. So they're coordinating with everybody here, sending their information out as they modify their programs. And then each of these are simply coming down through the reticulospinal tract, the rubrospinal tract, vestibulospinal tract. All of those tracts are modifying the programs as they synapse on that lower motor neuron. So the lower motor neuron is getting feedback from a lot of different areas. And then eventually we'll have our lower motor neuron that comes out and synapses on our skeletal muscle, our smooth muscle, or our glands. And that wraps up this section.